A total of 88 have now been confirmed dead in the U.S. following last Friday's deadly tornadoes. The deceased include 74 residents of Kentucky. Authorities say more than 100 people are still unaccounted for following a surge of devastating tornadoes. The severe weather destroyed a nursing home in Arkansas and heavily damaged an Amazon distribution center in Illinois, with destruction spread as far as Tennessee and Missouri. John Allen is Associate Professor of Meteorology in the Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at Central Michigan University in the United States, and he joins us now. Very good evening to you, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, Professor Allen.
Good evening.
Perhaps let's just first start with the basics. What is a tornado? And just on a scale of 1 to 10, we can measure, obviously earthquakes, but how do we know how bad a twister is?
So a tornado is a violently rotating column of air. It doesn't necessarily have to be a cloud stretching from the base of a storm to the ground, but it just needs to be a rotating column of air that exceeds about 65 miles per hour or 90 kilometers an hour, thereabouts. Once we have that rotating column of air, tends to produce extreme damage over relatively narrow swaths. So the swath of a tornado can range from anything from maybe a metre wide to up to a couple of kilometres wide. So these things are very variable in scale. In terms of intensity, tornadoes are rated on the enhanced Vegeta scale, which is a scale based on the damage patterns that we uncover afterwards. So engineers sort of look at how well a structure is resilient to a tornado's winds, and sort of make an approximation of what the wind speed associated with that damage is. And so in this particular case, the crews are out at the moment surveying these tornado paths to try and identify how strong these winds just exactly were.
And we understand that one of these, if my information is correct, ran for more than hundreds of kilometers. I think it was more than 300 kilometers. So I'd imagine that scientists like you are very worried about the intensity of this. And there were several. How does that happen and why?
So what we saw over the weekend was a tornado outbreak, and we have tornado outbreaks relatively regularly in the United States. Even in December, you can get them. We've had them on Christmas Day previously. So tornado outbreaks are not necessarily that unusual, but in this case, we had a tornado outbreak of about 30 tornadoes. There were several tornadoes rated EF3 intensity, which means they've got wind speeds between about 140 and 165 miles an hour, so well over 200 kilometers an hour. We've then also had one extremely long track tornado. We're not entirely sure whether there's one or multiple tornadoes along that path. Regardless of that, the impacts along that particular track, if it does go over, I think the 320 kilometers, it would be the longest track ever recorded associated with a tornado. The existing record is held by a tornado back in 1925 that killed 695 people.
I know these...
So what brings these in? Sorry.
Okay, no, go ahead, finish your train of thought.
I was just going to say, what brings these two conditions together is basically we have a warm air, an area of warm, moist air that's brought northwards onto a boundary or a big low pressure system, and then we get the conditions being right for tornadoes over a very broad area, which allows for a tornado outbreak.
So I was going to ask, what is a typical number of tornado outbreaks that you can have that would not be considered as worrisome? And as you talk about the heat and humidity, we've been talking a lot of climate change. Is it climate change in general, or the heat and humidity at this time of year specifically?
So it's very unusual to see temperatures like what we saw. It's certainly not unprecedented, but we saw temperatures that were above 26 degrees Celsius in much of the area where we saw the tornado outbreak. We saw very, very humid conditions as well. And if you get the right conditions, any day of the year could produce a tornado outbreak like this one. It's a little early to say whether we could attribute this particular environment and this situation to climate change. We've certainly had situations like this in the past. And the research isn't quite there to be able to attribute a single event like this to climate change. That said, if we do have these unseasonably warm conditions at this time of year, the other ingredients that are present certainly favour the development of tornado outbreaks like this one. Usually the US sees several tornado outbreaks a year. This one definitely produced what will probably be the strongest tornado of the year.
I believe La Nina has been fingered as creating some of the unusual conditions that you're seeing, particularly across the Mississippi Valley. Has it increased the propensity for tornadoes to emerge?
Yeah, some research we did a few years ago now that showed that during these La Nina conditions, there is definitely an enhancement, particularly over this region. We do see an increased frequency or an increased likelihood. Clearly, one climate signal doesn't necessarily result in it. It sort of weights the dice. So it's a higher likelihood of seeing this environment. But warm conditions in the southern US, even into the central US, are generally favoured when we do have La Nina conditions. So it's likely that La Nina was one of the contributors to this event. We also had a Gulf of Mexico where all the moisture comes from that was extremely warm. It's like a bath down there.
So what kind of ingredients, bar what we've already spoken about, would create the perfect storm, so to speak, for something that you have to look out for in your studies as you go ahead and study this particular outbreak and what is likely to exacerbate it?
So one of the factors that sort of comes in addition to having that sort of energy available for the storms to get very strong updrafts, is you also need changing wind directions with height. So the way to think about this is if the clouds at an upper level are moving from one side to another, and you see the clouds at a lower level moving in a different direction, that's what wind shear is. What wind shear does is it allows the storms to persist for longer. Your garden variety thunderstorm, this is not one of them. This storm is a highly organised system that has to be organised to sustain itself. The supercell that produced this tornado persisted for over 7 hours and tracked hundreds of kilometres. So it was in a very, very favourable environment for a very long time. And that tends to be the conditions we see these very, very long track tornadoes. You sort of need this ripe environment for an extended period to get these strong tornadoes to persist.
So I believe there are places where tornadoes are likely to occur, like in Texas, like in Oklahoma, but these changing conditions or phenomena that we're seeing, does it mean that we are going to start to see tornadoes in places where they're unexpected?
So Kentucky's no stranger to tornadoes, nor is that particular area of the country. We have seen big outbreaks like this. It's been a few decades, but they do get these outbreaks occasionally, and we've seen them all the way out to the East Coast. In this particular case, there is also some research that's shown over the past few decades that maybe there's a little bit of a trend towards the east in terms of the conditions that are favourable for this tornado development, and that may be playing some role here as well. Whether that's attributable to something like climate change is certainly something we don't know just yet.
Anything that you find interesting also about what has occurred, and any ideas about if there's a possibility of seeing another outbreak soon given the atmospheric changes?
It's always difficult to sort of pin down these outbreaks, our predictability. So how long we have to sort of predict these things ahead of time maybe stretches out to say about 8 days for most outbreaks. So anticipating another outbreak is a little bit difficult. I think it's, in this particular case, it's a sort of a bad set of factors where we have an area where there is relatively high population density. If a tornado happens over the Great Plains of the United States, there's rarely someone there to impact. Further southeast, the population increases rapidly, so the chances are much higher. It was also nocturnal, so we tend to see a disproportionate share of fatalities associated with nocturnal tornadoes. That's because people aren't necessarily paying attention to if they're getting a warning or that information. And then the other problem is the building structures. In this part of the country, socioeconomic conditions and indeed the availability of shelters is much less. And when we have those situations, if people can't get walls between them and the tornado, then the chances of fatalities and injuries is much higher.
Which is what I was going to ask. Is there a particular time of day that tornadoes strike? And is there anything that you can do to get out of its way, given the speed of it sometimes?
So this particular tornado moved at 55 miles an hour, so around about 70 kilometres an hour thereabouts. So it's moving very quickly, and that doesn't help either. In this case, warnings were around about 20 minutes ahead of the tornado arriving at a given location, so that's a fairly good warning and anticipation that it was arriving. Generally speaking, the tornadoes are occurring in the late afternoon, so around about 4 p.m. Through to around about 8 p.m. local time is the most common time. In this case, we're a little bit later than that. Generally speaking, for tornado preparedness, the best thing you can do is get to a room with no windows, preferably as many walls between you and the tornado as possible. In that scenario, the likelihood of fatality is extremely decreased.
Thank you so much for speaking to us. Very interesting information that you're helping us glean from your expertise. That there's Professor John Allen. He is Associate Professor of Meteorology in the Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the Central Michigan University in the United States.